I thought I would start out tonight and just bring us back to Metter. This young lady was 16 years old, and she rode from Jackson Hole, Wyoming to Bozeman, Montana, and it was the most important memory in her life. She lived to be 87, and she lived halfway between here and Chardon on the side of Little Mountain. This is Elizabeth McMillan, my mother-in-law, who when her husband died and my wife died, we would sit and talk about Yellowstone with a drink. Now here, just so you know, there is somebody important that came from Metter, Ohio. This is Stephen Mather, was the first director of the National Park Service. He moved out of Metter at an early age and went to Chicago, but we'll forgive him. He was one of the Mathers. Here is the first Mather that was in this country, Richard. And this is a library. Again, I thought this is my excuse for bringing Richard into the story. Richard Mather published the first book published in North America. It was called The Bay Psalms Book, and there it is. And it sold at auction 3 years ago. The copy that Yale had sold for $3 million. So it's not, I don't have one here. Cotton Mather was his grandson. And it was interesting, Richard Mather started Harvard, and Cotton Mather was one of the people that started Yale. Kind of interesting. Still in the book business, we're now back in Yellowstone, and one of my favorite places in the park is the library. They have a remarkable catalog, a remarkable bunch of books. One of the books we're looking at here is the diary of Lewis and Clark when they crossed through Montana on their way to the Pacific Ocean. But there's the copy. I've touched it, and it's great fun. And Bill Gates came out to look at it, just to see it, to touch it. Didn't want to buy it. And here is also of interest to me, the very first copy of Scribner's Magazine, and this is the very first article and the very first page of Scribner's Magazine, and it's great reading about Yellowstone. Well, the story started back when in 1959 I was born and raised on a farm in the state of Maryland, and during World War II my father went off to the South Pacific, and when he came back he said, you know, my best friend was an assistant superintendent of Yellowstone Park, and he said, we ought to go out there, so we ought to go out there. Well, I was used to a farm in Maryland, chickens and cows, and we drove across the countryside, and it was amazing, and we arrived here at this huge building. I can't believe it. And a geyser, I never knew there were such things as geysers. So we were here in Old Faithful Inn, which is still one of the places that gives me the shivers. It was built, whoops, you can see, it was built with all local lumber that was cut by the crews that worked for 2 summers in building the building. Old Faithful. And then all of these hot springs. And I was fascinated with the hot springs because they knew that there were critters living in this boiling water. And years later, a biologist found bacteria that had to have boiling water in which to spawn and to create. The name is, it's a thermophilic bacteria called, I forget.
Sorry.
At any rate.
As far as I could take you was extremophile.
Extremophiles, yeah. But at any rate, I'll tell you one of the stories. I'm going to throw in a couple of stories here during the talk. Walter Cronkite, when he retired, was interested in this thermophilic bacteria, Aedes sollicitans. And he came out to the park to look it over with his wife before he brought in a crew to do a film on the bacteria. The interesting thing to him was the fact that everybody was scientifically interested in this bacteria. And then some practical person realized, well, they learned that it is the basis of all DNA testing. And so all of the money that came from DNA went someplace else, not into Yellowstone Park. But so at any rate, that was the story that Walter Cronkite wanted to tell. And we were having breakfast at Old Faithful Inn, and his wife Sally, who was just wonderful, and the superintendent. And Mr. Cronkite said, I'm going to be right back. You guys go ahead and finish breakfast. I'm going to go out and buy some postcards in the little store. So he was out looking through the postcard rack, and we were walking up, and a woman walked up to him and said, excuse me, did anybody ever tell you you look just like Walter Cronkite? and Walter took a deep breath like this, and his wife walked up and grabbed him by the arm, and she said, but he's dead. He died of, the woman said, I'm sorry, I really screwed up the story. She said, you look just like Walter Cronkite, and he drew up his head just like this. And she said, but of course he's been dead for 2 years. And that's when his wife walked up and grabbed him by the arm and said, yes, he died of egotism. And so there are so many little stories like this of Yellowstone that as I say, I've been there every summer almost since I first went out there. And I worked at the Natural History Museum. My job was environmental education and the Future Scientist program. And so I figured, great, we'll take all these kids out to Yellowstone and we'll have a course. And I'm interested in the water. Oh, by the way, this is, I jumped ahead a little bit. When we were having, my father, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, and I were having breakfast. And the assistant superintendent said, well, we got bad news. In order to ride into the backcountry, Tom's got to be 15, and he's not 15. I don't know what I was, 8 or 10. And so he said, we'll have to cancel. The superintendent said, nonsense, you guys go ride into the backcountry. Tom and I are going to go fishing. So this guy's name was Rogers, and he's a famous superintendent. And so they went off riding, and I went with the superintendent, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, here were bison, and eagles flew overhead. I mean, I was used to chickens and cows, and here were bison and eagles, and it was very exciting. Any rate, after being blown away by the superintendent of the Park Service, I went on with life and had kids and took them out to Yellowstone. Here's my son Tucker catching his first fish. There they are exploring the geysers. He lives in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is pretty close to Yellowstone Park. And they have 40 inches of snow already. And Tucker, my son, has a son who I've taken up to Yellowstone. Here's this little critter when he's now a big critter. Here he is, 11 years old, and he caught the largest fish on a fly rod in the state of Wyoming. And the governor had an award, and he gave this little rascal the award, and he said, what fly did you use, young man? And Brent said, well, it doesn't really have a name. I just sort of tie what's hatching at that time and coming off the water. So here at 11 years old, he's tying his own flies. At any rate, here we are in Yellowstone. It is so beautiful. This is the Hayden Valley that, you've got to go to the Hayden Valley. You'll like it. The course that I taught was on water, and because there's lots of water in Yellowstone, there's vertical water, the Yellowstone River, and there's horizontal water. and then there's bacteria. There's the water is fascinating there. So, and here's one of the hot springs. Old Faithful Inn is a great place, and it's where we had our board meetings. We set up something called the Yellowstone Association. It's actually been going for a long time. And we would have 2 meetings there a year. And this guy that's walking out with his wife has the best fly shop in the world. It's called Blue Ribbon Flies. I am a fisher person. When I went out with the superintendent that day, we waded out into the Firehole River, and he said, "Son, here's a fly rod, and you just drop the fly in the water, and it'll go down, and maybe you'll catch a fish." I said, "I know how to cast, for gosh sakes." So, there was a little stream coming down about 50 yards away, and I put the fly there, and wham, a Yellowstone cutthroat trout like that. So I been just in love with the Yellowstone fish ever since. But they have horses. Now, this was the 100th anniversary of Old Faithful Inn. We'll get to wolves, don't worry. Here's a fancy birthday cake for the 100th anniversary. Now, I wanted to also touch on the women that have had so much to do with the history and the good things of Yellowstone. This is Suzanne Lewis. Suzanne was the first woman superintendent of Yellowstone National Park and one of the first female superintendents in the National Park Service. Yellowstone, by the way, is the largest of the national parks. It was the first national park in the world. It is larger than the states of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. It's huge, and there are 350 people that work there year-round. It's a big operation. So to be superintendent of this thing is not just historic and fun, but it's a lot of work. And Suzanne did a great job. Here she is dancing with one of our board members. We had a great board. This guy was the retired chairman of 3M. And it's kind of interesting how the board came together. When we first met, this was like 2 superintendents earlier, the superintendent asked me, he said, "You are in charge of putting our board together." And just by absolute blind luck, I had the telephone number for Mr. Lawrence Rockefeller, who ran the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. So I called him up, told him what we were doing, and he said, "Be at this phone, I'll call you back at 3 o'clock tomorrow." Well, he had put together a board, the retired chairman of 3M, the head of the largest advertising firm in the world, the head of United Airlines, and just he put together this incredible board, which really helped us. Here's another woman that has done amazing. Her name is Elizabeth Williams, and she was born on a ranch in Colorado, got a scholarship to Yale, and worked every summer for the Park Service. After she got her graduated from Yale, she got her master's, and she was named the head of operations. That is, all of these 350 people in the park reported to her. And a lot of them are huge, old, rough cowboys. Here she is dancing with one of her cowboy employees, and she was able to handle it. Nobody thought she could, but she could handle all of these people very well. This is a lady from Rocky River, Ohio, Diane Chalfant. And when I was working at the Natural History Museum, I was also working down in the Cuyahoga Valley Park with the National Park Service, getting it set up. And Diane was one of the early employees in the Cuyahoga Valley. And one day she came in and she said, "I just got a promotion. I got a promotion to go out to Yellowstone. I'll be the director of the science programs." And so this was the day that she was so happy that she was leaving. And she went home to Rocky River and put her stuff in a suitcase, put it on the back of her motorcycle, and rode the 1,400 miles out to Yellowstone on her motorcycle. So Diane's good. She just retired. This is an amazing woman. This is Janet Leigh, and Janet Leigh has been the secretary to 5 different superintendents. So basically, like every president except for Mr. Trump goes out to Yellowstone, and she has to work with his staff and put together his trip and things like that. She is all dressed up for the 100th anniversary of Yellowstone. A lot of it was in her honor, but she was really a sharp lady. I'll tell you a story about Janet. A Canadian company bought 800 acres right on the northeast corner of the park. And this is one of the most beautiful areas of the park. Mountainous, a little stream comes down through there called Slough Creek. And this company was a mining company, and we were sure they were going to mine what was down there and ruin the stream. And everybody tried to figure out how we can get this land from this Canadian company. We just couldn't do it. And then out of the blue, Bill Clinton was president. Bill Clinton had the Canadian government buy the land and donate it to the U.S. Forest Service to protect it. So the Park Service, the superintendent, decided, well, we got to have a celebration to thank Mr. Clinton for what he did. And we set up this ceremony, and we didn't want any cars to go out there to this area of the park. So they got 2 buses, and we were all driving out. My wife was there, and she said, "Do you realize that that's John Denver sitting in the seat in front of us?" I said, "Oh, that's great." Well, so this little 11-year-old girl came up the aisle and sat down next to John Denver. She was the daughter of the guy that runs the concessions in the park. And she was 11 years old, named Lucy. And she said, "Mr. Denver?" And, "Yeah." He said, "Have you ever written a song about Yellowstone?" "No." "Well, we got wolves now. You could have wolves howling. And, you know, everybody knows about Yellowstone. It'd be a really good idea." He said, "It is a good idea. What's your name?" She's Lucy. He said, "Okay, I'll dedicate it to you, Lucy. That's wonderful." So Lucy went on back to her seat, and I went up and sat down next to him, and I said, I heard what you just said, and I think that's wonderful. But if you give that song to the Yellowstone Park Foundation, it'll continue to give money over the years, and it'll be great. Outstanding, wonderful. So I give him my card and say, this is how to do it. So we get to the park, or out to the area where we're having this celebration. And my wife and I were standing there, and I said, you went to the same school that Hillary Clinton went to Wellesley. Did you know her? And she said, "Well, we were in a class together, but I'm sure she doesn't remember me." Well, this helicopter came in, boom, 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 boom. Down like that, the doors open. There was Hillary looking around, and she said, "Wellesley!" And so they all caught up and started talking about college. And at the end of the ceremony, Bill Clinton, I was with the superintendent standing there, Mike Finley, and the superintendent came up and said, Bill Clinton came up and said, "You know, I would love to get away from the media and the Secret Service and just run for an hour by myself and not get eaten by a bear." So the superintendent said, "Okay, Mount Washburn." So we get into the helicopter, and the idea was that the ladies would go back to the Mammoth, the park headquarters, and have lunch, and we would go off to Mount Washburn. So we flew up to the top of Mount Washburn, and we were doing this. Bill Clinton had his running shoes in his briefcase. He took off his shirt, and he had a bulletproof vest on, which was really interesting. Took off his pants, and he had red boxer shorts, bright red silk boxer shorts. And we let him out at the top of Mount Washburn, and we flew down to the bottom. And about half an hour, 45 minutes later, he came running in, and he said, "That's the most fun I've had in 8 years. Thank you so much. That was really great." He said, "You ought to have seen the expression on people's faces that were hiking up the trail when I went running by them in my red boxer shorts." So we went back to Mammoth. He took a shower, and we had lunch, and that was a good day. I got one other story to tell you that was really interesting. I haven't gotten to the wolves yet, but the people that were really interested in the wolves would come out, and the most interested was Ted Turner and his wife Jane. And they came out to the park, and of course the superintendent and I went out with them, and my wife was there too. Well, my wife and Jane went on down to this restaurant outside the park, north towards Livingston. It's a really nice little restaurant, and we finished off our thing, and I was with the superintendent, Ted Turner, sitting in the front seat. We're driving out of the park, and when we drive out of the park, he said, Mike, what's the one thing I could do that would be the most helpful to Yellowstone Park? And Mike Finley said, on the other side of the Yellowstone River, right over there, is something called the Church Universal Triumphant. They have 500 acres, and they are an incredible problem. They go to the front of the entranceway into the park with machine guns and tell people that the devil lives in there in the hot springs. And they've caused us all kinds of problems. We'd love to get rid of them. And how much? And he said, I don't know, ask Tom. Well, I was actually negotiating with the head of this church, which was a woman, by the way. And she was, at any rate, I didn't want to talk about the transaction or anything like that, and I'm sort of goofy anyway. We were driving down through what's called Yankee Jim Canyon. It's a beautiful, big, slick canyon that right alongside the road and right alongside the Yellowstone River. So I said, well, you know, Mike is a geologist, and he would know where to plant a charge of dynamite in the side of Yankee Jim Canyon, bring the whole thing down into the Yellowstone River, and that would flood them out. And the superintendent said, oh, Tom. And Ted Turner said, that's a great idea. It's a great idea. Well, we get to the restaurant, and we walk in, and you know, there are all kind of people sitting around tablecloths, and it's a very nice, polite place, and our wives were at the table way over there. Ted Turner stands in the doorway and says, Jane, we're going to flood the bastards out. He was a character. At any rate, this is an interesting little story. This young lady was a student at Lake Erie College, and I'll remember her name, but I can't remember it now. And she read in the newspaper that the lynx, the Canadian lynx, had been found in Yellowstone, and it was a very rare animal, and there are very few of them, but there was a study going to be done that summer. She said, I want to be on that study. I said, well, if you pay for your ticket, I'm going out to a board meeting, you can come with me. So we go out, Kitty Hayden, and we go out to Yellowstone, and my friend that you saw earlier, Diane, is the head of science, and we have supper with her, and she says, okay, Kitty, write me a single page why you want to study the lynx and give it to me tomorrow morning at breakfast. So we go back, and Kitty works all night long on this thing. I said, let me help. No, this is mine, I'll do it. So she writes her single page out about 35 times, and the next morning we go and have breakfast, and very proudly she slides the paper across to Diane, and Diane just sort of glances at it and said, it's not going to work. Sorry, Kitty. Gushing tears. Oh my God. Off to the bathroom. I said, what's up? And she pushes the paper over to me. I want to study the LINKS. And so she said, if you can't spell the name of the study species, you're not into the program. So we got Kitty a job taking care of roadkills to feed the wolves. Yeah, here's a remarkable young lady that I have some really good friends in Cleveland that do all that kind of interesting things. And we went fishing down to Argentina, up in the Andes, in this beautiful little camp. And it was being run by this young lady who had just graduated from college and was going to law school the next year. And she learned how to speak English with us. It was amazing how quick she picked it up, got rid of the accent and everything else. And she found out that I had a lot to do with Yellowstone. She said, I will give you my soul if you get me a job in Yellowstone. So I said I didn't want her soul, but I got her a job in Yellowstone. She was working on the legal end of things. And there's a remarkable building. When you go out there, you got to see this. And it was over 100 years old in the Mammoth, the park headquarters. And it's the jail right down the middle of the room. Single room is a bar, grill and whatnot, network. And that's the jail. Very few people ever visit the jail. So, at any rate, when I taught these courses, the daughter of the superintendent was in one of my classes, and she was in college, and she had graduated, and she was now running a visitor center in Canyon. And she was in her visitor center, and a group of loud dozen people came in, and one of them was smoking a cigarette. And she said, "Excuse me, sir, you can't smoke in here." He walked over to her, took a puff on his cigarette, and blew it in her face. A ranger had walked in and saw this. I think he liked the young lady too. He walked over and he tapped the guy on the shoulder, and the guy turned around like this. So I hit him, knocked him down on the floor, turned him over, dragged his arms behind his back, put on a pair of handcuffs. And everybody says that when he was putting on the handcuffs, he was kneeling on the man's head. So he dragged him out and put him in the car, and took him off to the park headquarters, to the jail. On the phone, he was calling the superintendent and telling him what had happened. And this whole group of 8 or 10 people that was with this guy were saying, "Listen, you let him go. He didn't mean to do anything. He's very important. He works for the governor of the state of Montana, and you let him go." So they took him off and put him in jail, still in handcuffs. And superintendent came over and just to see this guy, and the group of 8 or 10 people were all yelling and screaming, and the governor of the state of Montana called up and said, "Let him out, let him out. He didn't mean any harm." Well, anyway, things finally calmed down. He says, "I'm not going to let the guy out until we look at all the facts and get all the facts." So this young lady goes over to him. Here she wants to be a lawyer, and it's so important to her to go through law school and go to lawyer. And she said, "Do you realize that blowing smoke in the face of a federal employee is assault and battery, and you better get a lawyer?" And the guy said, "I am a lawyer." And she told me that in the evening, and she just couldn't believe that a lawyer would do such a thing. The Yellowstone Park Foundation, I told you about all these people, and they're still good friends. And we had a reunion. It's hard to think that it's been going for this long, but we had a reunion here. And this is the one picture here that I did not take. This is the reintroduction of the wolf. And that's in the blue jacket here is Mr. Babbitt, Secretary of Interior. And they really didn't let this wolf free. They put him in a pen. And the idea was that they wanted these wolves that came down from Canada to get used to the park before they let them out and have them go back to Canada. And also get used to people. And they did. Now, this is an amazing story. I worked at the Natural History Museum, as I told you. I got a phone call, and Tom, this is Terry Harmon. I got a kid, one of my students, that wants to do his senior project on wolves. Any ideas? I said, yeah, there's a professor at Oberlin that's doing work on wolves on Isle Royale. I said, okay, thanks. Well, that was 8 years keep going by. I'm standing out in Yellowstone, and this big hand taps me on the shoulder. I turn around, and he says, my name is Doug Smith, and you're the bastard that got me into this. And it was that high school kid, gone on, gotten his doctorate and everything else, and he was the head of the wolf program in Yellowstone Park. He's from Chardon, Ohio, and Doug appears in National Geographic, and he's all over the place. So, at any rate, here's Doug and a wolf. Now this lady, this is Rick McIntyre. You got to read Rick's book. As I told you before, he knows more about wolves than anybody has ever known about wolves, because he has seen them almost every day of his life. 1950 something, he's written up in the Mount McKinley in Alaska. He was a young man, a high school student, I guess, that was working on the wolves of Alaska back then, and he worked on wolves every day since. At any rate, Rick is retired from the National Park Service, but still lives out there in Silvergate. And he's absolutely, you can't tell, he's a gangly, goofy kind of a guy, and his life is wolves. Well, it was amazing that there's so many young women that like wolves. And every summer there were 5 or 6 or 7 college-age women that loved wolves and moved in with Rick and fed him and basically took care of him in this little cabin he had in Silvergate. So here's one of the young ladies, and this is one of my heroines. You won't believe it, but you see her with the wolf. There's in the wintertime or in the fall, when they get the first snow, they have a little light airplane that flies out, a little Piper Cub, flies out over the wolf pack, and somebody sitting in the side shoots a tranquilizer gun down at one of the wolves and tranquilizes it, gets out on the wing, and then jumps off of the airplane onto the back of the wolves. That's this lady. She is so proud of the fact that she's the only person in the world that'll do this. And she's amazing. She's light enough so that it doesn't hurt the wolf, and that breaks the fall. Wolves did come down from Canada, and they have become pretty much not tame, but they aren't afraid of people. So in the morning, if you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, the way Rick does, and drive out through the Lamar Valley, you'll see a red little Subaru that they gave him to, actually it's not red, it's yellow. And it was given to Rick by Subaru. And he knows where to see the wolves, and he parks, and all the other cars come in and park and then hike on up to see the wolves. It's actually amazing that you can see wolves almost every day. It has meant so much to the community because the park, I can't remember, but I think it's like 4 million people visit the park every year. And this has increased potentially after the wolves came. People stay in the local hotels, so the income for the local community has risen thanks to these people that come to see our wolves. That's not a wolf. I love all of the critters in the park. This is my favorite place in the park is Slough Creek, you might guess. And this is one of, then about 40 or 50 of these birds existed in the world. It's called a trumpeter swan. It flew over my head. And later I got this picture of one of the breeding pair. This is something that you should remember. They don't talk about it, but it's a little, yeah, where the boiling river comes into the Yellowstone. And the Indians actually built that little caravan you see of rocks there. So it's been used for years. There you see, you can pick whatever temperature you want, from boiling to freezing. And the water is flowing, and you've been there. Yeah. Outstanding. I will tell the story. My wife and I were there one day, and it was in the evening, and we were skinny dipping. And a ranger came by, all dressed with a hat and pistol and everything, a woman ranger. I thought, oh boy, we're in for trouble. We shouldn't be skinny dipping. So the rangerette came down and took off her hat, took off her pistol, took off her pants, she came in skinny dipped with us. She said, it's after 6 o'clock, anything goes. So. Now, I mentioned Lake Erie College, and I'm very fortunate that I had a horse operation over here. And I had all kind of wonderful kids from Lake Erie College that taught the course. I had 60 kids riding there over the weekend. And one of the very best is Sophie. Sophie was super with horses and better at training the kids. When she graduated, she went back to the Galapagos Islands where she grew up, and she just got a scholarship from the United Nations to get her doctorate. She was summa cum laude at Lake Erie College, by the way. And in the springtime, she starts at Oxford getting her doctorate with the United Nations. Here she is taking a blood sample of a whale shark. That is the largest fish in the world. And here's little Sophie taking a blood sample. Okay, my favorite place, Slough Creek. Maybe I'm going too long. You got to go to Slough Creek. It's great. There are all kind of critters there. I would have been arrested for taking this picture if anybody in the Park Service saw it.
And other things too. No.
Yeah. I drove up and parked next to this guy. He was standing in my favorite parking lot at Slough Creek, and there he was. But you see all kinds of critters. This picture was taken from a vehicle as well. I would not be this close to this animal. I pulled in, and I saw him sleeping, and I pulled in right next to him real careful and rolled down my window, and he woke up. This is his first few seconds awake. He's looking at, what is going on here? At any rate, that's a grizzly bear. These are baby grizzlies. That's one of my favorite pictures. I was fishing in Slough Creek, and these little rascals walked down, and it's a great place. That's a black bear, not as interesting. Here is the northern entrance to the park. You've been there? And yeah, by Gardner. That was Teddy Roosevelt sort of was really responsible for the park's early day, and this was dedicated to him. This is in Mammoth, the park headquarters. And this is the road into the Lamar River Valley. In the upper left-hand corner there, you can see some buildings. That's called the Buffalo Ranch. Well, after I taught this course for a couple of times in the park, one of the teachers from Montana said, you know, it's silly. We have to go down to Colorado to get recertified every 8 years to teach in Montana. So I told the superintendent, he said, hell, we'll teach the courses here. So we drove up to the University of Montana and got them to approve of it. And there was an abandoned buffalo ranch out in the Lamar Valley, and he fixed it up really nice with solar panels to provide the electricity. And here are the cabins, nice beds and everything else. Well, this is the Yellowstone Institute. And none of you look like you're still in college, but you can get college courses. They're all kinds. Go on the internet and just put a Yellowstone Institute, and you can see courses there now, which range from wolves to photography to water to all different everything, and it's a very, very popular operation. So at any rate, the thing that I care about more than anything is plants. I guess I'm a botanist. And I did a book on the plants of Yellowstone, and nobody will publish it. These are called elephant head pedicularis. Really interesting. There are lots of fascinating wildflowers in the park. This is this first little flower that pokes through the snow in the springtime, called a balloon flower or a moonflower. So that is all I have to say, and I appreciate very much your tolerance. And any questions or observations? Yes?
What kind of camera do you use?
This is all a Nikon with a 200 millimeter lens. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if I have the right park and the right animal, but is Yellowstone where the wolf repopulated Yellowstone? It was by bringing them in, introducing them back into the park,
Right.
like the growing started again and repopulation.
Yes. There are 5 packs of wolves, and the way they brought them in was interesting. And Rick McIntyre and Doug Smith had a lot to do with this. They figured out if they just come in and let the wolves loose, they'll head back to Canada. So they built pens, and they kept them in these pens for at least a summer, and fed them roadkill, as I was saying. And the wolves got sort of used to people. And there are now 5 packs of wolves, maybe more, but the last time I checked, there were 5 packs of wolves that interact with one another. If you read Rick McIntyre's book, you'll see about the wolves that have battles with each other, and it's kind of fascinating. But they tolerate people very, very well. Yes.
One of the things that I had read was that once they introduced the wolves back in, that the whole ecological system improved and returned.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. It's fascinating. There were so many more elk in the park because there were no predators that the elk were just eating the park out of existence. When the wolves came back in, they started preying on the elk, and the elk population sunk down to normal. And all kind of things like, all of a sudden there are beaver. I said, nobody ever saw beaver in the park. Well, I wonder what happened. Well, the reason they were gone was the fact that the elk had been eating all the willows along the stream. Well, they couldn't go by the streams now and eat willows because the wolves would eat them. So the willows had come back and the beaver came back. And there are lots of other instances like that of how the ecology sort of balanced out. Yes.
What did the local ranchers think?
That's a really good question, and that's where Doug Smith is so incredibly good. There have been maybe 2 cattle killed by wolves. The wolves used to come out of the park with the elk when they went out, but sheep are a lot easier to kill than cattle, so they were killing a lot of sheep. There is a federal fund that if somebody kills your cow, you get paid for the cow. So, but the ranchers don't care. Cowboys, ranchers don't like the federal government, and wolves mean federal government. So they don't like them no matter what. And that's not true of all the ranchers. Doug handles those situations, and he's told me stories about how ranchers have actually come to like wolves and realize that they have become a significant economic boost in the community. So, but that's the hardest part of his job, is handling when wolves. And they don't have to kill anybody; they just have to walk on your property, and the ranchers get all upset. Anything else? Oh, I thank you so much. Appreciate it. And